Hello. So this is a start meeting summary with AI companion. No. Okay. Th- This is a meeting to discuss the cascading settings feature, and because the workspaces feature and the Web IDE feature, which me and Paul respectively are involved with, is looking at using this for handling settings that we want to inherit and lock. So I come up with a list of several questions here in the doc and gathered y'all here based on your participation and call outs in the Slack thread. So if nobody has anything to start with, we can, I guess, just start going through the questions that they had.
Yeah.
Cool.
Oh, there, it's in the agenda. I see. I was taking notes above. I'll take notes below.
Sorry. That's
Okay. Okay. Great.
um so the the first question we had, like, we're maybe looking at extending this down to the project level for workspaces, maybe not, but we saw that y'all for the duo features enabled sort of added it, but didn't add all of the features like locking. And it's like, was there a reason you couldn't do that, or is like it just wasn't in scope and there's no reason we shouldn't be able to add locking?
Okay, I can answer that. The reason we didn't add locking is that I don't think we saw a value in locking because the person who can lock it is the person who can change the setting. It's like the same role for us. Maybe in your case, it's different.
Right.
But
Like if there's a level below that, which we are definitely going to have, you would care about locking it, right?
yeah, so if an admin, if you have to have an admin role to set this setting to true or false, and you also have to have the admin role to set it to locked or unlocked. There's no additional value to being able to lock the lowest level object because, but maybe you have a different use case, do you?
Yeah, we at least on workspaces, we have uh a more expansive level of precedence. So it's not just instance namespace hierarchy project. Like we will have probably an agent level for the GitLab agent for Kubernetes, which has we have our own settings level of precedence group that's associated with the agent. And
Mm.
so that would be like this other level. So then in that case, we're still not sure how we want to put them, but in that case, if project was part of cascading settings, it would be not no longer be at the lowest level. And we would maybe want to lock it there and say, okay, the agent can, even if it's not part of cascading settings, look and respect that locking to say, no, you can't override it at the agent level.
So do we have roles on agents?
Like we have
Because
our
today,
own, and the other part of the context here, which I've linked at the top, we have our own like settings module that has its own idea precedence and defaults and how things are inherited, and which we use on both workspaces and the Web IDE. And it's based on the railway oriented programming chain thing, and it's basically just goes down in precedence and the last one wins. And we're looking at shimming in the cascading settings there to say, okay, for instance, in namespace level settings, like that one step in this thing, and then we can have agent and then possibly even user level settings below that as well.
I
okay. So oh, sorry.
I don't think you should have any problems with this, and I don't think it should interfere with Duo features. Whatever the lowest level is of the setting or the attribute that you're dealing with does not need locking. But I would say any level that is not the lowest level should implement locking.
So I guess the question is like, can you like opt out of locking at one of the lowest levels or not? If we added at the project level, we can just say, hey, in this scenario, we don't care about locking at the project level, but in this scenario, we do. Would that be the thing
Um,
possible?
if there's not a lower level, nothing's going to check for a lock. The lock isn't checked like whatever the attribute is set to on let's say the project level. There's nothing at the project level that's then going to look for a lock. The lock always comes from a lower level, or rather it's looking at the lock from the lower level. So Duo features enabled would just not have a lower level, so nothing's going to be concerned with the lock, whereas maybe your attribute does.
So in the UI, like, for example, if we added the locking support at the project level, Duo features would just like, or another feature that used it at the project level would just like not show the locking checkbox and just ignore it, even though it was supported by the backend infrastructure and database. Does that make? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I guess I would have to go back and look at what sort of helpers we have now for the UI. And Jesse, maybe you're more familiar with that. It might be a question of what is the helper support, but in terms of like the backend framework, I don't think there's any problems.
Yeah, we can definitely look at it. I just wanted to present the question and see if we knew off the top of your head that that's a good answer.
Correct me if I'm wrong though, Drew. You're saying that it wouldn't make any sense to add a lock to the project level because there's nothing below it. Is that what you're saying?
For Duo features enabled, or for most of the other attributes that we have right now, because project is generally the lowest level. But in your case, if you're adding something that does have a lower level,
we're saying, I see. In our case, we actually have a lower levels. What you're saying, Chad.
And another scenario we could see is like user level settings, right? It's like, okay, this is the same setting that can be overridden at any of these levels all the way down to the user, and the user is actually a lower precedence than the project. And it could be project level.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would also think like this is way down the line, but forks is also could probably be considered a lower level than the root projects, but that's a totally different. That's just brainstorming a different conversation. That's interesting. Okay, I see. I understand the context here.
All right, let's move on to the short meeting.
Well, I have I have a follow-up this question around this. So from the UI, when we have these settings that are inherited, have we looked into or solved the problem? Or I'm a group and I've overridden the setting, but now I actually don't want to override the setting and I want to just use my parents' setting. Have we solved that problem where we can unset at any level the override?
My understanding, my memory working on this is that that's not a solved problem. And this kind of goes into the area of where cascading settings can be a little confusing to end users, because it's like, well, you inherit from your parent and then once you override it, you're always overriding it unless the parent is locked. And that's something that I think, Emily's done some research on, and specifically for Duo features enabled as a setting. But I think more in general, when we first introduced this setting for Duo features, we were like, we have this framework for cascading, and then actually explaining all the nuances of it only inherits if it's unset, and once you override it, it always overrides is a little bit confusing. But I don't think we ever fixed that kind of unexpected piece. I mean, I guess what you could do is instead of setting it to false, you could just set it to nil, right?
That's what we're playing with our, like, the agent level stuff. Like nil means unset and will not override.
Yeah. Okay. I was just curious because I thought I could actually probably see that being a problem to solve. So we might.
Okay.
It out.
I would talk to Lindsay Shelton. Is that her last name? She's been working on a lot of the front end. Lindsay Shelton on Duo.
Okay.
Cool. She's in a lot of the front end stuff on that, so she would also be probably the right person to ask about the view question in this list.
Cool, that's great.
AI framework.
And real quick before we move on, I want to mention on the if there's something lower than project, we might actually need some additional logic in cascading settings for project specifically, because I think all of the logic about locking and overriding, that's probably all in group or namespace. Project, the project model was probably a stripped down version of that because it was the lowest level. So that makes sense. We might need something more there.
And Emily, yeah, we've discussed exactly that, like especially for say a JSON field, right, where they could just maybe paste in some JSON. How does unsetting that? Like, do you tell them to blank it out, and that means, you know, that gets translated to a null if it's an empty string? So any designs or thinking you've done around that that you could share would be definitely welcome.
Yeah, so I've taken over some of this work from Katie as of like a month and a half ago, and we're working towards now more of a clean cascading setting. So now at like the group level, you have three options to either set on by default, off by default, or never on. On by default means you can shut it off at subgroup and project. Off by default means you can turn it on at group and project, and never on is just off for the entire everything underneath. So we're moving towards like a slightly clearer UI for some of this, but I can share. I shared some of the epics that include that down below.
And that reminded me that there's one way in which, so we have various cascading settings around GitLab, and then we have Duo features enabled, which is like a little bit of a hybrid. And the way that it's a hybrid is we added background jobs so that when the parent value changes, we actually change the value of all the children. So, and I'm remembering this now. We actually schedule a job that changes the value of all the children. The reason for that is that database wise, it's a cheaper lookup. You don't have to actually go through the whole hierarchy. You just know what the value is. The exception to that is if the parent is locked. If the parent is locked, then you go to the parent. But otherwise, you just look at what the current value of the child is. We decided to do that partially for performance reasons, but also we thought, you know, in UX wise, it was a little bit more understandable rather than seeing a null value and going, oh, it's null in a database, but it's, you know, true because the three hierarchies up is true. That was confusing. So this whole like null value thing is more than how cascading settings works for most settings, but not for ours.
Okay, interesting.
Database was okay with that.
Database was okay with that.
Because
I'll send you that.
I remember having these conversations when we initially made the framework, and database was like, no, you cannot mass write. Like, no, don't do it. But I 100% agree with you that in terms of lookup, it is way more performant. And I think I mentioned in the Slack thread that I have always had performance concerns about the cascading settings framework for that reason. But if we move to a model like you're describing, then it would be much more performant.
And so it's actually a background job that runs to update. So we're not super real time, but hopefully it's like fairly real of when things get updated. Regarding that, and so that's custom tailored just towards the Duo setting. Is that right, Jesse?
Exactly. Yeah, we built that logic for Duo. I'm gonna find the MR now.
Okay. I can imagine us wanting to do something similar because like we're talking about, you know, needing to look up settings every time someone, you know, loads the Web IDE. And if that is an expensive operation, which it totally can be if it gets lots of subgroups and stuff like that. I can see us wanting to do this either earlier or later. Was there a discussion about using like Redis to cache some stuff? Like, is that an option also, rather than like updating the database value itself? Like, do you think that using Redis to cache the lookups? Because we kind of do that for like markdown rendering, which sounds a little similar. I don't know if that sounds interesting or if that was talked about at all, or I'm just brainstorming.
I didn't talk about that.
Okay.
Did anybody else bring that up? I don't have any memory of that coming up for us.
I don't remember. We may have discussed Redis back in the initial implementation. If we did, it probably involves Stan.
It seems like it would be a nightmare for cache invalidation, though. The two hardest problems in computer science.
But that's kind of what's happening though with like updating the database. It's kind of similar.
Well, that's reinforcing it. That's saying everything is now this new value that we know about.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, we probably would not be able to leverage that on workspaces because we totally expect different values to be from different levels of the namespace hierarchy, especially in .com.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are definitely trade-offs. And I feel like we discussed that as well as the potential for each level to get out of sync. I also wonder, Jesse, how you might address a case where a sub group or project would override the parent setting. And then if you change it at the higher level and write down, do you still know that that was overridden at a specific lower level?
Yeah, you don't. I mean, that's that's an edge case, right? So somebody goes through and they're like updating the settings in the project and the sub project or the group and then the subgroup and then the project and then the jobs get out of sync. You could have settings be unexpected values, but ultimately we were okay with that as an edge possibility because like you can always just update the setting again and change the value. Like it's unexpected, but you can fix it later.
Okay, can we move on to make sure we get to the rest of the questions here?
Well, I want to park there just to Chad. I do think that performance of the reads is going to be, I don't know if it'll be as critical for workspaces because it already has like a lead time of spinning up a thing. But for the Web IDE side, it is going to be important. So that's, I'm shelving that, but we need to unbox it. And probably I need to create an issue just to discuss that.
Yeah, I don't know, like performance things, unless they just seem horribly, horribly egregious, I put them in the bucket of premature optimization until they're a problem. I don't know, it's not always the best approach, but.
And I just slap Redis cache whenever it is a problem. So that's.
Exactly. Just cache it. So this one note that's in the cascading settings docs where it says null value is not allowed. Like we already have, as I said in this settings module, that we're going to plug this in as a step. We already have a concept of pre-existing defaults. So I'm wondering, like, is that a hard requirement for some reason, or just one of those like it didn't apply because the instance used to be the highest level of precedence, so it was put in there. Like in our case, we probably want to allow nulls at the instance level because we already have a default, and therefore we want to go with the same thing we're talking about with Emily. Undefined means I don't override this. In this case, it would be I don't override the default that is like in our module defaults at the highest level of precedence or the lowest level of precedence. I explained that very, very poorly. The point being, is there any like hard blocker that you know of to like just say no instance level setting can be null too?
Okay, I understand now. I was trying to skim the docs. And so you're specifically asking about application settings.
Right, because normally I think instance level settings like are the defaults, but we have like another whole level on the framework we're going to put this in that we manage the defaults at. It's basically just a hash in the code, hard coded.
Let's see. I guess technically there's nothing preventing us from changing that. It was just because null values have a specific meaning in this structure and instance was the highest level. So it didn't make sense.
That's the perfect
maybe
answer.
enough. In a scenario like you mentioned, maybe it now does make sense. I don't know.
That's interesting. You're almost saying like Chad, from an abstraction perspective, there is a higher level than application settings, which is hard-coded defaults.
Higher in
And I
the
think
chain, lowest precedence, which is like the hard-coded defaults for every
Sure.
setting you have. And then just like cascading settings, every higher precedence gets a chance to override it or lock it and
Yeah.
or lock it.
I think that makes sense. That's interesting.
Cool. So Katie already shared the epic around the changes. That's fine. So jumping to the next one, like I saw you added some view components for this in addition to the Haml things that are documented. Like, how reusable are those? Or are those mostly just like little one-off components just for the stuff you did, or other things using cascading settings also using these view components and reusing them already?
I think that's probably a Lindsay Shelton question. I think that she's done most of those view templates stuff. One thing I would potentially do here is pull in the newly renamed G Personal Productivity team, because they technically own settings. And one thing I learned through working with Personal Productivity, I put G in front because that's their Slack channel name, but G is just
that's my group. We're here in spirit.
You're here. Oh my gosh, sorry. I'm so sorry. I think you all, because okay, so Emily was saying that earlier that she inherited this work a little bit from Katie McCoy, and Katie was involved working with you all in your former incarnation. And like the thing that Katie drove home to me is she was like, please don't make your setting a special snowflake setting as much as possible. Like, use the framework as it is. And if you really need to do something different, let's talk about it. But that's, I guess, what I wanted to make sure was brought up here at some point.
Yeah, I'm hearing a few things that we could improve upon in the core framework that would make it easier for everybody.
Okay, next one. Some of the latest stuff we added, like view helpers, if there are any in the project level support, aren't in the docs yet. Who should be the DRI for making sure those get in there, if not actually doing the work? Are you muted, Jesse?
Did you think I was gonna volunteer? Sorry, just to clarify this question, you're saying the newly added functionality being the view helpers that were added for Duo features enabled?
If they're at all reusable, and also the project level support stuff, which is mentioned at all in the docs currently.
Yeah, I can. Well, the view stuff I'm not gonna be good at doing, but I will. I did create an issue for document cascading settings for projects, and I assigned myself 5 months ago. So I can do that.
I totally don't have like dozens, if not hundreds, of issues like that.
Already, so I have an issue for that. So I will document that. I don't think I would be the best person to do the view piece.
Jeff, what can you think of who would, or should it be Lindsay? Like, are you saying Lindsay because she actually worked on implementing them? Okay.
Yeah, I can ask Lindsay to do that. I can take action to create issue for view and ask Lindsay to write that down.
Thanks, Jesse. Awesome. Sorry.
It would be helpful. We have done nothing with this part of the code base yet, so no one on my team would have any clue what any of this is.
I was just diving into the code and documentation. I think that the cascading logic is neatly encapsulated and abstracted away from the front end. I don't think a lot of it bleeds into the front end. So I think we have a number of Haml and Vue, just general settings, reusable stuff that's what when I look for Duo chat enabled and how it's used, I see it It just looks like every other kind of settings thing. Or not duo chat enable, but whatever the duo features enable one was.
But it's really nice, even if it's just like, here's the few lines of component code you need.
We do have a lot of just settings components, and I think that's might be sufficient. So we'll see.
But even just calling that out so people have a place to start rather than just trying to start from a blank page.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess we're almost at time.
So
probably skip most of these. They've been covered.
Do you mind if I sneak in my last question?
Sure, go ahead, Paul.
So if we have a setting that we're mostly just interested at the instance level and root group and not super interested in the capability of overriding it at the subgroup level and the project level, is this the right tool for the job? Is using cascading settings going to set us up for, success down the road? What are your all thoughts?
My thought was that if you think it's at the root group level now, are you positive that's always going to be the case?
Yeah, I think that's a great call. And so one big question is it easy to migrate non-cascading settings to cascading settings, or what are your all thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, so we started with just the project level setting on our side, and that made the transition a little challenging because when we added the project level settings, cascading wasn't even on our radar. So we set a default value in the database. And then we realized, to make this cascade, it should have a null default value instead of defaulting to true. And that's actually kind of what led us down to this path of actually overriding the values in the database whenever you update the parent, because that nully cascadey behavior wouldn't work anymore. So if it were me, going back to what I said a few minutes ago, I would just use the framework, even if it doesn't fit perfectly for what you want, because like our settings are so confusing already. So every new way we do them is like another level of confusion. But then again, I don't really know the full, like they might have really good reasons for not using.
Which is why I initially made the settings module that we had before I realized cascading settings existed, but it's still really useful because cascading settings, in our case, is still only like a slice of that precedence, a few levels of it, but not the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
I wonder would we have to put more logic in there to specifically not show it at the subgroup level?
I think
because
so.
I'm guessing if we're sharing views and everything, like it's just subgroups are going to kind of get it for free. So we'd actually have to circumvent that.
Yeah. That's a product conversation too, as I really don't know like what product's vision is here, but that was the discussion. But I've seen MRs do that where we don't want it overridden at this subgroup level. And so we just show read-only fields for what it was, what the values resolved to be, and talk about where they come from. And I've seen us do that, I think in one-off ways. I don't know if they've used cascading settings, but
which is what we're talking about doing with the locking behavior on Web IDE. Like starting with, it's like hard-coded to be locked at the instance level, and maybe we'll enable that to be configurable later.
Okay.
That's true. You could just lock it at the top group level.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand.
All right, I want to respect time. We're at time. Jesse, that the second to last one, that was just a random one I had about how do I actually see the the duo step at the instance level. I could not figure out, even by like literally hacking the code and putting in taking out all the guard clauses, how to make that actually show up. So I was just curious. You can answer that offline now.
Will do.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks everyone so much for your time. This is very helpful. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.